Good afternoon. I'm Greg Swindle, and I am the president of the Herald of Truth Ministry. Some of you may have heard of us. We turned 70 this year. I'm not going to be the speaker. My name is just a placeholder there. Who will be speaking? I think you're going to be really pleased that you decided to come here to speak on this topic of reaching millennials. Currently he's our director of church relations, but he's also our director of what I have coined as Next Gen Men, reaching the next generation ministry. And so without any more to do, I'll turn you over to Jim Williford, and he'll identify himself, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is Jim Williford. There are a couple of things you're going to be disappointed about this course. I'm just going to get them out there right now. First of all, I'm not Greg Swindle. That should be a big disappointment to you. The next thing is that this class is scheduled for 1 hour. It's actually a 2.5 hour to a 4 hour class, depending upon the amount of audience participation and questions that we get. So I'm going to tell you this right now. The class has been developed it's a seminar. It's been developed for churches so Herald of Truth can come to your congregation and give this class for you at your location. So if you like what you hear today, take note of it, let us know, and I'll come to you and give the thing in whole, okay? I'm not going to rush through this. If any of you have done any teaching at all, you know that you learn best by teaching, don't you? So I've learned a lot as I've developed this course. Would you pass these out, please? Sure. As I continue to do the course, and I've given it probably about a dozen times now, I continue in my studies to find things that will add to the course, and I just add them to the course. So the course gets longer, and so my talking time gets longer as well. A little bit about me. I am a retired Marine Corps Sergeant Major. I was in the Marine Corps for 26 years. My family and I'm married to 32 years, 3 kids, 8 grandkids, live in Abilene, Texas. And I'm working on this job because I think it's valuable and means a lot to the congregation, to the church. I've been a member of the Churches of Christ all of my life, and we've worshiped in many different congregations all around the world, most of them very, very small. I feel like I need to stop talking about that now and kind of get into what we're doing. I'm going to roam a little bit because I've got a fancy microphone. That's what this is, the microphone. It's not a bomb. So I'm not going to push a button and suddenly explode here. It's actually a microphone. So I'm going to roam around, and the cameraman may have a hard time finding me. So without further ado, this is who I am, and this is what we're going to be talking about. So on leading millennials, this class is from this book by Barna Corporation, From Making Space for Millennials, A Blueprint for Your Culture, Ministry, or Leadership and Facilities by Barna Group, published in 2014. Now, if some of you don't know who Barna is, they're a Christian polling group that was founded in 1984 in Ventura, California. They do a lot of data on American religion. They've worked for such companies as the American military, Visa, MasterCard, Disney. They've been around for a while. And this particular study was done in 2014, was completed in 2014, and they had interviewed 30,000 millennials over a 10-year period. So the data that I'm going to present today is reliable. This is what the thing looks like if you want to go to Amazon and order it for yourself or your library or a church library. I'm going to get out of the way here so you can see what it looks like. It's a good book, and you should definitely do so. With the information presented here today, you should gain a keener understanding of who millennials are, how millennials think, what millennials are looking for, how to manage millennials' expectations, and how you can meet millennials' longings for leadership, mentorship, and companionship through life. Now, I have a couple of disclaimers here. I am not against millennials. So, as I describe millennials, in fact, I have one sitting right very front and center, right here. And there's one right over there. So I see 2 millennials in here. I am not against millennials, and sometimes people will actually raise their hand and say, "You seem to be very hostile to." I'm not hostile to millennials. I've got 3 millennials of my own. They've developed their own little children on their own. So I worked with millennials. I trained millennials. I was a drill instructor at Paris Island for 3 years. I know how to work with young people, and I also know what millennials are. And so if you work with millennials and you think they're great, superb, and I hope that they are. Okay? And I'm not saying that they're not. I'm saying they're very valuable, and this is why we need to know how to learn how to communicate with them and what they need, what they want, and they really want great things. They want the same things you do. So there's that one disclaimer. Another thing is I am a retired Marine, so if I say, it's now, it's 09:30 or whatever, it's just military time, that's just who I am. And if I do some kind of weird thing like a facing movement, or I say as you were instead of I meant to say, don't worry about it. That's who I am, and you just need to understand that. I'm not trying to be
We tried to beat it out of him, but
the beatings will continue. Okay, so traditionally I would have a couple of short videos, but we don't have speakers here, so I'm going to skip these videos. It's a shame because they're good videos about how millennials haven't forgotten spirituality. They're just looking for new venues, and how millennials reject religious doctrine, generally speaking. But now I'm going to ask this question. Before we can talk about millennials, we need to talk about how we got here as a culture. How we got here as a culture. Do I have any veterans in here? So I have no Navy people in here at all. That's kind of bad. Listen to this. If you are ever deployed on a U.S. naval vessel, and I've been deployed on two and spent time on the USS Nashville, but this is the way you wake up every morning. There's in the berthing area where all the bunks are, we call them racks because they're stacked up on the wall and you just kind of get in one. It's a rack, right? Every morning there's an intercom system all around the ship. Every morning you hear this. There's a whistle, whoo-woo, and a young sailor comes on and they say this: reveille, reveille, reveille. All hands heave out and trice up. Sweepers, man your brooms. Give the ship a good sweep down fore and aft. Make sure you get all ladder wells, ladder backs, and lower decks. Now, sweepers. And that's the way you wake up. And this is a good thing because it's the Navy's way of shaking you and kissing you on the cheek and saying, hey, it's morning. It's time to get up now. Wake up, sleepyhead. And it's a good way because when you're in the ship, you're not on the ship, you're in the ship, and you can't tell when it's daylight. And they say, get up. It's time to go to work. Get out of the rack. Time to go to work. Okay? This is a good thing because you know it's sunlight, you know you have work to do, and you get up and you go about your business, and that's what you're paid for. And it's a good day because every day that begins that way automatically is a good day. Wouldn't you agree? Yes, yes. Okay, good. I got them snowed. Okay. So the thing about that is that unless you were deployed on a U.S. naval vessel, you would never know that story I just told you. It's not in any movie. No one talks about it at the coffee shop. That's just the way things are. It's a world view specific to that world. It exists even though you don't know anything about it. It has existed traditionally, and it will continue to exist as long as there's a U.S. Navy. And it probably happens that way in all the other navies too. I don't know. But this is a real world thing that you don't know about, and yet it exists. Now, Christians don't need to know about every single world that doesn't exist, but there are some that we do need to know about because these worlds have created the world that we live in. We don't need to be aware of them all, but we do need to be able to wake up, heave out, and trice up because time's a wasting. One of the first things that we need to know in our Christian walk, in our society, is that like in all Western societies, there's been a sea change in the concept of truth. And this is the first place we need to gain awareness because truth is very important. It's seminal to everything, from interpersonal communications, who you trust, to expectations of behavior, how we should act, to what we really believe in our hearts. And knowledge of the sea change has been available to us for 50 years, over 50 years. But it's generally not something of which we are culturally aware as Christians because it exists in the world of academic theology. And traditionally, we in churches have been really afraid of academic theology. We resist academic theology. In every talk that I've been in this meeting, I've heard the words, some kind of idea that says what they're teaching at colleges is not good. Academic theology is not bad. We don't need to be so resistant to academic theology because it brings to us words that we need to know, like what I'm going to tell you tonight. So, what is truth? Where is that in the Bible? Where did we hear the words, what is truth? From a guy named Pontius Pilate, who had Jesus right there with him. And who is the truth? Christ. The truth is standing right in front of him. And he says, okay, what is truth? And he turns away without waiting for an answer and walks away from truth. It's John chapter 18, verse 38. What is truth? In our world today, in this culture today, we have famous people like Oprah Winfrey, who's famous for saying, well, that may be your truth, but what? My truth is this. And then in that sense, we have no truth. It's a secular truth. We'll talk about that in a second. What is truth? I'm going to tell you what truth is. And if you're writing down notes, take this down. Are you ready? Aristotle said this, so it's not new. Truth is to say of what is that it is. Write that down. If you're writing down, I can wait for you. Truth is to say of what is that it is. And to say of what is not that it is not. Truth is to say of what is that it is, and to say of what is not that it is not. And now, since Aristotle has been long gone and his words were written down, and we live in this world of secular reasoning, we have a good definition of the truth. In 1968, in 1968, a theologian named Dr. Francis Schaeffer wrote a book called The God Who Is There. It's an astonishingly prescient book about the condition of the world in the latter half of the 20th century, the post-Christian world. You know we live in a post-Christian era? Did you know that? We live in a post-Christian era. Post-Christian era and the state of Christianity in the last half of the 20th century was addressed by Dr. Schaeffer. If you are interested in that at all, he wrote a book called The God Who Is There. You should get the book. It's great. In this book, quite a number of important facts are laid out for our examination. The most important fact that he lays out is that the old framework for truth, remember there's been a sea change in the concept of truth, the old framework for truth has long ago been dismantled and surreptitiously replaced by a new one. The old framework was built upon presuppositions, absolutes, and antitheses. Presuppositions, absolutes, and antitheses grounded in Christian scriptures. It's very important. The old worldview was grounded in Christian scriptures, and these upheld a societal view of truth consistent with Christian scriptures and informed a Christian morality within a people. We're talking about a culture. Since this Christian morality was accepted by most people in all of Western society, almost every Westerner recognized Christian presuppositions, absolutes, and antitheses. Let me explain. If all of the United States were Christian and understood and believed in the Bible, understood the divinity of Christ, the morals that came with that, then all of the United States would agree with this statement: adultery is wrong. Wouldn't we? We'd all agree, because we all would presuppose it based upon our moral foundation, which is the Bible. It's a Christian presupposition. And a presupposition is assumed. It doesn't have to be said. If I know we are all Christians in all of Western society, I know you all believe like I believe. Adultery is wrong. It's antithesis, and that's an absolute. So adultery is wrong, absolutely. There's never a time adultery is correct. You agree with that, correct? Well, we're all Christians, and we all would. What's the antithesis to that? That adultery is right. Well, we know that that's an antithesis to an absolute presupposition, and so we reject it. So every absolute has to have an antithesis. You can't have an absolute without an antithesis. It's the wrong way, and we don't go down that road. I used to tell my Marines there's two roads for you to go down. There's the road of consequence and the road of reward. Which one do you want to go down? Well, I want to go down the reward. Well, good. Where are you right now? Because the acts that you're committing are definitely things you can perceive of consequences coming your way fast. Is that what you want? No, Sergeant Major. Turn the wheel. Go to the road of reward. Well, if we are on our absolute road of reward, we know the wrong way, and you have to have that antithesis in order to show you that. Does that make sense? So we have this Christian morality which says, hey, There are presuppositions, absolutes, and antitheses based on Christian scriptures. They inform a Christian morality within you. This is how we're informed. This is truth. Truth is to say of what is that it is. Presupposition, absolute. To say of what is not that it is not. Antithesis. Schaeffer saw that at certain points in the histories of both Europe and the United States that this framework had been taken down, surreptitiously disassembled and replaced by another. And it appears to be so much like the old one that you don't notice it at first. Because of this, a person living with the idea that that old framework is still set up can't be blamed for not noticing it and still acting like we all live in that same world, a Christian world, not a post-Christian world. We don't talk about post-Christianity. We don't like to talk about post-Christianity because we're Christians. We don't like to admit that the chain has slipped out of our hands over the past 50 years and that secularism has gained a foothold in Europe and pushed Christianity out of Europe, and now it's doing the same thing to the United States. Christianity is not in trouble, but our culture is. A person must simply at some point come to realize this, come to realize that we live in a dark and desperate world in which our social moral tether that had once secured us to all of this, our predecessors as well, is gone. And we now live in a world that's hostile to our idealism. And how deceptive was this framework switch? So deceptive that most Christians will never come to understand it unless we talk about it like we are now, even though Schaeffer announced it to the world 50 years ago. Now, he believed that this took place in Europe. He believed that this took place in Europe in 1913, or in the United States beginning in 1913, was completed by 1935. That's pre-World War II. But it happened in Europe as early as 1890. And instead of presuppositions, absolutes, and antitheses, now we have a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. And I'll explain all this in a moment. Self-authentication, existentialism, and humanism. What does all this mean? Well, we have the thesis like we already had, and its antithesis, but if we combine those two things together, we get a kind of a new thing called a synthesis. And a synthesis is easy to accept, because really what you're doing is combining two things and creating something. This is the basis of Marxian thought. This is why leftism and Marxism go hand in hand. We're going to get in some interesting territory. Self-authentication. Abraham Maslow. You ever heard of Maslow's theory of, the hierarchy? Maslow's pyramid of hierarchy? Yes, that's it. At the very top of it is what? Self-authentication. The ability to rise yourself above all of your needs. Hierarchy of needs, that's right, yes. All of your needs and become self-authenticated. That leads to existentialism and to humanism. What is humanism? Humanism just states that humanity is the highest form, period. There's no God. There's no spirituality, unless you like a spiritual idea to your life. But a human is the highest form of existence. Schaeffer named the point at which this changed the line of despair. I don't know if you can see it. It's that straight line that goes across right there. It says line of despair. And the U.S. after 1935, this is where we currently live according to Schaeffer. This is important to understand. Schaeffer named that point and began to trace how humanism destroyed all of our disciplines all the way down to theology, which is the very last one. It's a stair-step process. So philosophy opened the door to humanism, and then it affected our art, our music, our general culture, and our theology. So think about this. In philosophy, when ideas are put out, can they be corrosive? Can they be corrosive over a long period of time? Can they ease into other areas and corrode those too? Yes. You look at art. Did you know that there was a classical school? You know who Picasso is, right? He was all those crazy flat people with the eyes on both sides of the face and all this kind of stuff, right? And everybody thinks that's wonderful and great. But you know, Picasso was trained as a classical artist, and the human form could really do it really well. How did he devolve? I'm saying devolve, although art critics may not say that. You know, he may be evolved, but how did he devolve from something familiar into something so abstract? It was a matter, of course, of philosophy getting into the world of art. Nude descending a staircase doesn't look like not a person, much less a nude, coming down a staircase. Okay, it's abstract. Throwing the paint all over the stuff, it's very abstract. It represents a devolution from classical art into modern art. You really can't tell what it is, and it's so abstract that 2 or 3 or 5 or 100 people looking at a piece of art might say, I see this, I see this, I see this. Could be all different. When you look at a face like a Rembrandt, you know exactly what you're looking at, right? Do you understand how that worked? And then it led down into music. We went from classical music, which was really praise music written by Bach and those guys, into music that is so cacophonous that's not really even music. It's noise. Today, the most popular music that in our culture is rap and hip-hop music, which is absolutely immoral. If you ever choose to try to listen to it, it will corrode you. I live in a neighborhood in Abilene, Texas. Abilene, Texas, I'll tell you, it's just like any other place. It's got a lot of meth problems now. It's got a lot of homeless problems now. And I see these people walking. They've got their phone and they've got their earbuds and they're just doing all this rap stuff. They have no home. They have no place to eat. They have to go and get food at the shelters, and they're filling their minds full of Satan. Really, is what they're doing. And that comes from our musical culture, which was fed by art, which is fed by philosophy. You see how it's going? And then all the way down to general culture, which affects all of us, because there are words they say on television today you wouldn't dare say 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. There are relationships that men and women are having that you would never express publicly if you were even having them in private, right? What is this whole transgender stuff going on? It's ridiculous. Sorry, if you don't like that, I'm sorry. That's the Marine in me. It's ridiculous, okay? It comes from philosophy, through art, through music, general culture. And then what's the last one? Theology. How does that affect theology? Well, how do we reach these people? Well, we've got to change. You know, the word can be translated and shift around, and, blah, 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 blah. We can change this and that, and we can get a lot of people in here, and then what are we doing? Are we grounded in Christian presuppositions and antithesis, absolutes and antitheses? No. What are we grounding ourselves in? The word is secularism. You know what secularism means? We say it all the time. I like etymologies. I like looking words up and finding out what they really mean. You know what secularism means? It means this present age. Present age. It's Latin, secularum. It means present age. What did Paul tell us about the present age? Romans chapter 12, I think. Do not be conformed to what? This age. Be transformed. How? By the renewing of your mind. That's a pretty deep statement. We are in the world of the mind in philosophy, but it's a secular world of the mind. It is not a scriptural world of the mind. And so we are not renewing our minds in philosophy. We're actually conforming to the secular age. So, I say all this to make this point. This is a very important point. Though philosophies are slow acting, this happened over a period of 140 years, by the way. I'll explain. Though philosophies are slow acting, they are long lasting, long reaching, and they have influential consequences. So today, when we look back in the period of time in our own lives, say to the 1960s, we examine the rebellions that have occurred in just the United States since the 1960s. We examine them through a lens related to their respective context alone, without knowing any of this. We come away with a very superficial understanding. It's the philosophies behind these rebellions that originated much, much earlier and took decades to develop. They're poured as poisons into our mill streams generations ago, and we've been drinking from those mill streams by the slow-acting effects of the philosophies being corroded from the inside. This is what's happened. We've gotten away from Scripture, and we're in the secular mentality. We're in a post-Christian era. We have to wake up, and we have to understand this. So, now, I want to go over some of this philosophy if I can. We don't really need that, but that's going to help in a minute. Okay, here we go. These 5 guys here, bear with me, please. Philosophy is a complicated discipline. Now, these guys wrote a lot of stuff other than what I'm going to tell you today. But how Hegel wrote a few things that Kierkegaard really seized on. And he wrote a few things about Hegel that Jaspers really seized on. And so the line of thought goes all the way down. It's not all Hegel wrote. So let me talk about this. Considering the following, these vignettes that I'm about to talk to you about are not meant to reflect a philosopher's entire personal portfolio and their life. I'm going to talk to you about how they simply explain, according to Schaeffer, how these men's separate philosophies eventually came to contribute to the moral decline we're experiencing now in our culture. So Georg Hegel, born in 1770, died in 1831. He was a Christian, a German. He's the author of Hegelian Synthesis. This is the guy I told you about. We have synthesis, antithesis, or thesis, synthesis, and antithesis. And you combine the thesis and the antithesis together, you come up with something called a synthesis. He said, this is not a cause and effect ending in absolutes and antithesis, but in thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And this philosophical construct later became the basis for Marxian thought. Let me explain this. Whenever you have Marxism in any philosophy, and you have these philosophies too in your own world. In the Western world, in the Christian world, when we're thinking things through and we come to a problem, what do we do with that problem? We solve it. There's a solution. There's a before the problem, there's an after the problem, and sometimes it changes our idea because we're honest about solving the problem. But in Marxian thought, with this synthesis, you have your thesis and antithesis, you combine them for a synthesis. All that means is I'm not solving the problem, I'm just making it into something new that I can deal with. In this sense, Marxism does not require them to solve any problem. We look at it as Westerners, as capitalists, and we say, it's full of problems, it'll never work. But a Marxist looks at it and says, they don't matter. The problems don't matter. We drive over them. We use force. Hegel's idea here about this synthesis stuff informed Marx to write Das Kapital, which was the economic way of doing Marxism. And Lenin said in 1961, listen to this, quote, it's impossible completely to understand Marx's Kapital, and especially its first chapter, without having thoroughly understood and studied the whole of Hegel, 1961, end quote. So this is dangerous. Just opening the door outside of presuppositions, antitheses, and absolutes is very dangerous. Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard, he's Danish. He's also a Christian, 1813 to 1855, known as the father of modern existential thinking. He wrote so much that his personal journal consists of 7,000 pages, a diary of 7,000 pages, not to include his professional writings. So this is one thing that was pulled from Kierkegaard, but he said, look, we have a problem in that rationality and faith have no relationship with each other. You've heard of this. In order to really tackle the hard problems, you have to leave rationality behind and take a gigantic leap of faith. This is where the leap of faith idea came from. He seized on that from George Hegel, who also informed the Marxists. It's not Hegel's fault, but this is what happened. Karl Jaspers, he's a Swiss guy, Catholic. He lived from 1883 to 1969. This is where things begin to get abstract, kind of like art. Classical design, and then suddenly things begin to get abstract. Philosophical thinking the same way. Jaspers was an existentialist, and he taught his students that every one of them needed to come to what he called a blink of an eye experience. In German, it's Augenblick. Okay? You just like to say German words from time to time because you got to say it like Arnold. Augenblick. This blink of an eye experience was also known as a final experience. It's a fleeting instant which impresses an individual so deeply that he or she literally experiences eternity within a moment of objective time. Listen to this. An Augenblick is a non-rational, non-logical, non-communicable experience. So if you have one, you probably won't understand it, you probably won't know about it, and you sure can't talk about it. How abstract can that be? And this is major philosophy. It provides a person with little, if any, true reconciliation, and he had to warn his students, do not commit suicide to find your final experience. Jean-Paul Sartre. You got to say it like that because it's a French name. Anybody speak French here? So if I said it like that, no one would know if it's wrong. Sartre. Sartre. Okay, it's like croissant. He's a French atheist. He lived from 1905 to 1980. And he said, we live in an absurd universe. All you can do is authenticate your existence through an act of will, and it can be a good or a bad act. And then we have Martin Heidegger. Heidegger is the last one here, a German reconciled Catholic, 1889 to 1976, bear with me. A German soldier at the Western Front during World War I and a Nazi and a member of the Volkssturm, civilian militia during the final months of World War II. Heidegger lived an active and self-centered life. He disagreed with Sartre's assertion, because like a Nazi would against a Frenchman, that self-authentication comes through an act of will. He believed it comes through an understanding of being there, Dasein, and from the dread of something beyond our own comprehension, or Angst. Now, why am I telling you all this? The lives and the careers of these men spanned 140 years, from 1770 to 1980. That's more than enough time for their existential ideas to be developed, to emerge, gain prominence, influence one another, and then derail the world of philosophy from presuppositions, absolutes, and antitheses to what we have now, today. It began 140 years ago. And now we are dealing with it. Mainstream Christianity as a whole does not realize any of this has happened. This is why we need to know it. This is why we should not push away academic theology. Distracted by and hopefully struggling against these new modern philosophies in their personal lives, yet still operating under the old presupposition that everyone still thinks that way, we're unaware that sometimes our antique methodologies of yesteryear are inadequate to taking on the challenges of today. Why do I say that? Does everyone understand where we are today? And everyone understand why I went through all of that rigmarole about philosophy? You still awake? I'm very happy to see your eyes. But if you remember these things, it's important because we have a problem in the churches of Christ. We have a golden age. What is our golden age? When were we supposedly the most prosperous Christian church in the United States? When were we the fastest growing Christian church in the United States? Everybody knows it. 1950s, 1960s. Let me tell you something. As part of my job for Herald of Truth and the Director of Church Relations and Next Generation Ministry, I'm in contact with a guy named Carl Royster over at 21st Century Christian who keeps all the data, or supposed to keep all. He keeps data. You know, we don't have a headquarters. We don't have a magisterium. We don't have a place where data is kept on all the churches that exist, all the churches that die, all the churches that are planted and born. We don't know. We don't know any of that stuff. And so where's the data that says the 1950s was our heyday? It doesn't exist. Show it to me if you know it. I've looked for it for a long time. I can't find it or find anyone who knows where that is, and I think it's a myth. I think it's a myth. But we act like it is the keystone for everything we have to do today. And so when we have problems in our congregations, well, we're having problems with, we're losing members. We need to get more members. Or we need to get more youth. What do? Well, we take our grappling hook and we throw it behind us and we pull up the 1950s. And we say, what worked in the 1950s will work for us today. After all, everything's the same. This is our problem. We no longer live in a Christian era. We're post-Christian. We no longer can use door-knocking campaigns, VBS's, joy buses, gospel meetings to great effect because the world has changed. It's not the 1950s anymore. The sooner that we understand this, the better, because we need to cut that rope. First of all, I think Prove me wrong. But I think our ideas about that era are mythological. We keep them alive by talking about them. There's no data to support it. Think about this. Living in a post-Christian era where everyone has a Ring doorbell, no one wants to have any contact with anybody from church, doing a door-knocking campaign, is it going to be as effective as it would be in the 1950s? Think about this. If you had a scale of 1 to 10, a person who was alive in 1960 not going to church probably grew up in a church. Because we're a Christian era, a Christian nation, understood who God was, who Jesus was, who the Trinity was, had Christian morality because of presuppositions, absolutes, and antitheses, and they were at an 8 on the scale. And so I knock on the door, and I say, you really should be in church, because they have memories of church, and they know church. They're going to say, you're probably right. I should go. And they will go. But today, an unchurched person is at a 3. Why? Because they're a millennial, or they're Gen X. What is a Gen X? Boomers in here? Raise your hands, please. Okay. You have kids? Those are millennials. I'm sorry, those are Gen X. I'm a Gen X. I'm 52 years old. My children? Millennials. Millennials are born between 1984 and 2002. They are from 38 years old to 20 years old. They are not children anymore. We're talking about millennials. If you're still thinking of a 5 or a 12-year-old, you're wrong. I'm sorry. You missed the boat. Millennials are now 38 at their oldest, 20 at their youngest. The oldest are astronauts, battalion commanders, captains of industry, housewives, mothers, fathers. The youngest are in college. They grew up in a world given to them by Generation X who said to them, you don't have to go to church if you don't want to go to church. In fact, we're not going to church. Generation X is told by the millennial, by their boomers, when they're 13, you're old enough to decide whether or not you want to go to church or not. My parents didn't do this to me. I sure wanted them to because I didn't want to go to church. And I would have chosen not to go to church if that had been given me at 13 an option to do. Most of my friends were given that option because it was wise in the eyes of their boomer parents who, in their youth, had left the church during the Vietnam tumult and come back because they felt guilty about it. Had one foot in the church and one foot in the world and didn't enforce church like their parents had. And so you see the denigration of Christianity as we go. And by the time millennials are born, they don't go to church. They have no memory of church. They've been told all their lives that churchgoers are hypocrites. There's no need for church. And they're not in the market. Now, this is not all millennials, of course, but this is a generalization of the millennial world. This is why it's important to know these things. So, when we talk about the 1950s, man, I'm telling you, a secular millennial does not want to see you show up on his or her porch and won't open the door. Nobody's going to put their child on a bus with all the sex scandals as there are in any Christian church and allow you to take them across town to a building where you can't watch and bring them home unscathed. It's not going to happen. I'm sorry. Vacation Bible School, you probably still do Vacation Bible Schools. We do at our congregation, and it does bring people in. It doesn't bring too many adults in, some. Brings a lot of kids in. That's good. It's a good opportunity for babysitting, and that's fine. We accept that. Gospel meetings, hold a gospel meeting. What you're likely to get is just a few people who are already Christians come to support your congregation. You're not likely to get anybody come to a gospel meeting. It doesn't work like that anymore. Why? Because we've got television, computer. Our time is taken up completely. In the 1930s and before, when there was nothing going on, yeah, have a gospel meeting. It's the only social event in the world. Everybody comes, and they stay for 3 weeks. We have to think about these things. Gospel meetings generally don't work anymore. So, now that we've talked about all of these things, we've got about 10 minutes, and we can get into culture. Any questions about what I've talked about this far? This is one. We're going to get into millennials. No, we're not. We're going to get into millennials just in time to close the doors. Yes, ma'am.
Talk about what doesn't work. Will you be talking about what does work?
I'm not going to talk about what does work. And the reason I'm not going to talk about what does work is because sometimes when I say things like a door knocking campaign won't work, well, I preach at a congregation in a small town of 642 people. A lot of people live in the country. The congregation is quite large by comparison, like 150 people in the congregation. But everyone knows the Hawley Church of Christ, Hawley, Texas, Hawley Church of Christ. It's the kind of the cultural center of the town. And so in that town, if we went and we did door knocking, it would be received. Okay? Generally speaking, no. So it depends on the congregation. If your congregation is well known in your town, door knocking campaign might work. It might not. Or if you're in a neighborhood or a suburb where you needed to get out in that area, if you were able to do that, it might work for you. It might not. So it's kind of up to your leadership to assess your area and decide what might work in your area, and that's where I'm going to leave it, because there are so many vast differences between churches. Does that answer your question?
I don't know, but I'm listening.
Well, the answer to your question is no, I'm not going to talk about it for those reasons. Does anybody else, does everyone understand that? Okay, go back and talk to your leadership at your congregation and find out what would work best in your area and decide for your congregation what would work. Generally speaking, those 4 things that I talked about are 1950s ideas that won't work today, generally speaking. Any questions about those? Thank you for the question. I appreciate it. Culture. This is a great little diagram here or illustration. Over here we've got the United States, the Statue of Liberty, which represents the United States. And then here in the middle we've got Europe, right? Tower of Pizza. I like to say Tower of Pizza instead of Tower of Pisa. And then you got over here all of Asia. The flights going back and forth, and so you know that this represents the world, and it's a smaller place than we think. Why am I talking about culture? Because when I meet somebody here in the United States, what do I typically do? Shake his hand, right? Shake their hand. But if I go to Asia, we don't shake hands. What do? We bow. Or, depending on what kind of where in Asia you are, you'll do the kiss on the cheek. So a culture is just there are different types of things. And in the American culture, we have our own customs, arts, social institutions, achievements. This is what is on your handout. This is what a culture is. Customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group. Do we have American social achievements that make us distinctly American when we talk about them? Yes. We have had a suffrage movement so women could vote. We've had a race movement, civil rights movement. So we have equality. We have landed people on the moon, lunar landings. Those are distinctly American social events that have shaped our culture. Would you agree? They don't happen in other worlds or other cultures generally, unless we do it first, and then it'll happen in other places. So all cultures have these things. We have an American worldview, our common values, assumptions, and allegiances. We all agree that freedom is good, that children should be protected, right? That sometimes you have to fight in order to maintain freedom. We all agree with these things, correct? Yes? Okay. Our assumptions are that all of us agree without us having to ask. I just asked, but I already knew you agreed with those things because we're Americans. And we have our allegiances. We have our allegiances to our nation. We have our allegiances to our state. Our allegiances to our silly football teams. Sorry. We get into sports. I just don't understand why we get so allegiant about that. American culture and American worldview, these form our outward expressions. Have you ever heard the statement, ugly American? Don't be the ugly American. When you travel to a foreign country, somebody should say to you, do not be the ugly American. What does that mean? Well, learn some language, learn some culture. Don't misrepresent us. We are Americans. We have outward expressions of inward attitudes. Sometimes our Americanism is not very savory when we go to other places. You know, I've never been to, anybody here been to Paris? Did they like us in Paris? Why? Because we're loud and we're not French. Okay? We're loud and we're not French. We are this to the French. But in Normandy, which is in France, we are number one. Why? Because we saved Normandy. We jumped out over Normandy out of great aircraft and landed on the beaches and saved Normandy in World War II. Two different areas. In one area, we're ugly Americans. Doesn't matter what you do, you're never going to be nice. In other areas, please don't go there and foul it up for us. Okay? Don't be the ugly American. So, inward expressions of a group. Let me ask you a question. Can this happen in a church? Your congregation is a reflection of who you are and who your surrounding town and who your town is. All the people in your town. Most people, and I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to talk in generalities here. Congregations of the Churches of Christ from sea to shining sea, California to Virginia, in the United States, there are about 12,000 of us. Average size is about 50 people. Average age, 55 and above. A lot of white-haired people in these congregations with very little generational replacement to replace. We're losing congregations about 100 per year. And that's an actual statistic. Before COVID, it was 80. Now it's about 100 per year. What do you think about that? What is the outward expression of the inward attitude of your congregation? Everybody has one. If we were able to get into the millennial portion today, which all of this is a setup for, is your congregation ready to receive the millennial generation? Or is your congregation still operating off of 1950s Christian era ideas? What are some of the things that you would expect? Would you expect a good relationship with your congregation? Would you expect meaningful worship? Would you expect to find a purpose there with your congregation? Yes? Are you going to your congregation because you have to? No. Are you going to your congregation because you love your congregation? Do you find meaning there? Yes or no? Do you find purpose there? Yes or no? Are you very tight as a group there? Yes or no? Okay. If most congregations are 55 and above and they're this way, they're tight, they have purpose and meaning for their members, if a millennial group comes in, are you going to be able to accept them? Or is your inward attitude going to repel them? Because you're in the 1950s still, and this is not the 1950s anymore. And if a millennial comes to you, are you going to say, yes, he's been baptized, however, we welcome you, but don't expect to do anything at this congregation until you're 35? Or until we get to know you better? Because a millennial can't accept that. Can you? A millennial wants to be put to work now, today. A millennial believes that he or she brings something valuable to the congregation the moment they step in. And it's not like they're about themselves. Millennials are all about service and worship. They're all about meaning and purpose. Okay? And so if a millennial comes to your congregation and says, I'm thinking about placing membership here, what they're looking for is really real, truly true, authentic relationships, meaning and purpose. And if there's not these things there, they will not stay. And so I'm asking you the question, is your congregation ready to receive millennials? Because if you can't offer meaning and purpose, if you can't put them to work, if you can't mentor them correctly, and if you are so set in your way that you cannot accept a millennial to mentor you, it's called reverse mentoring. A millennial will not stay. A millennial will go where he or she can find a relationship that's real and authentic with an older mentor who is going to allow them to mentor them as well. Purpose, meaning, and actual work now. Because millennials come preloaded with all kinds of good things that we could get into. And some of that stuff is technical savvy and entrepreneurial spirit. What do you need at your congregation in the post-Christian era? Technical savvy, entrepreneurial spirit. Are you going to allow a millennial who may be 30 or 40 years your junior to mentor you? Some of us have a problem with that. Some of us say, no, I'm going to teach them the gospel in the right way, and that's all great. That's all great. But if you don't let that person have a two-way with you, they won't be there long. And now that you know, if you don't allow it to happen, it'll be on you. Because this is something that's generally understood around the world. Okay. Now I'm pulling the brake, pushing the buttons, I'm going to turn off the engine. I've got to say, we're out of time. Sorry to leave you in the lurch like this, but let it be a teaser. Let us come to your congregation and teach you this stuff. I've got a couple more hours of material right here in this book that I could teach you about millennials. So, any questions about anything we talked about? Yes, ma'am. Entrepreneurial spirit. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Number one thing to do on a website to attract them, because that's the front porch. Practical.
Okay, so understand right away that a millennial does not expect church to be formed for him or her. What they want is old style church. They don't. So if I put some statistics on the wall up here, one of them is, I can't find. I feel like God is not at church. 39% said that, etc. Things like that. That church is outdated. The percentage of millennials who believe that is 8%, only 8%. And we've spent a lot of time and money and effort and talk about how, man, we need to update the church. No, we don't need to update the church. The church needs to remain the same. So to answer to your question is, just do a website. Just put together a website. And a millennial who will come to your church based on what they see of that church and then make an assessment of that church based on its authenticity, not on its flashiness. Does that answer your question? I know you want to leave, but I know some people have questions, so if you need to leave, that's fine. And if you want to have questions, just stay behind, and I don't have to do anything now except go to the airport and catch a plane. Thank you all very much.